From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
My name is Betsy Peterson. I'm the director of the American Folklife Center here at the Library of Congress, and I'd like to welcome you for the latest in our ongoing Benjamin Botkin lecture series. The Botkin series allows the American Folklife Center to do a couple of things. Most importantly, it allows us to highlight the work of leading scholars in folklore, ethnomusicology, oral history, and other cultural studies. And for the center and the library, it also is an important part of our acquisition activity. Each lecture is videotaped and makes its way into the permanent collections of our center, and also makes its way onto the web as a webcast that allows us to share this with patrons throughout the world and for generations to come. So with that said, please turn off any electronic devices you might have right now, or you will be in our archive forever. And today I have a wonderful honor. I have the honor of introducing a distinguished folklorist and dear colleague, Jane Beck, who is the founder and executive director emeritus of the Vermont Folklife Center. Beck first became interested in folklore while an undergraduate student at Middlebury College, and went on to earn a master's and doctorate in folklore at the University of Pennsylvania. In 1983, she returned to Vermont to found the Vermont Folklife Center in Middlebury, and subsequently served as its executive director until her retirement in 2007. And during this time, she grew the Folklife Center into an incredible, influential, and robust institution that continues to provide outstanding public education, research, and archival services to the state of Vermont. Jane is the author of numerous articles, radio programs, curricula, slideshows, videos, books, museum exhibits, you name it, she's done it. Jane has also published in numerous journals and magazines, including Canadian Folklore, Yankee, and Vermont Folklife, and has been aired frequently on stations including Vermont Public Radio and Adirondack Public Radio, and in fact is the recipient of a Peabody Award for radio work that she did focusing on Daisy Turner back in the 70s or 80s? 90s, okay. Over the course of her impressive career, Jane has also served 2 terms as president and several years as board member for the American Folklore Society. She was a trustee for Vermont Shelburne Museum. She sat on the Smithsonian Advisory Council for the Bureau of Folklife Programs and Cultural Studies, and most significantly, certainly for all of us Folklife Center folks here, she was a member of the board of the American Folklife Center. Jane has received numerous prestigious awards, as you can imagine, with that sort of resume, including the Governor's Extraordinary Vermonter Award in 1990. A Peabody Award in 1990 as well. And the name of the radio program on Daisy Turner was called Journey's End. She's also an honorary doctorate from Middlebury College, a recipient of the Benjamin Botkin Award from the American Folklore Society, the Vermont Governor's Award for Excellence in the Arts, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Center for Research in Vermont. So today we are delighted to have Jane here to discuss her latest book, Daisy Turner's Kin, an African American Family, which has just been published by University of Illinois Press, and following today's talk, Jane will be out front for those of you who might wish to purchase a copy or bring the copy you already have and have Jane sign it. It's really exciting. This is a culmination of a life's work and focus, and so we're really honored to have Dr. Jane Beck here today to talk about Daisy Turner.
Thanks, Betsy. I don't know where you got all that stuff from, but it's certainly not something I gave you. I apologize. Now, let's hope this is all going to work. Here we go. Okay, this is Daisy Turner, and the fascinating thing to me about Daisy Turner's Kin is that it's a family story told over 4 generations, over 2 centuries, by the Turners, for the Turners. And I know of no other family story of African American descent that goes from Africa to a small town in Grafton, Vermont. This story was placed in a larger context of social, cultural, historical framework. And the important thing to remember about Daisy Turner is she was first and foremost a storyteller. And she comes out of the West African griot tradition. Her grandfather was a Yoruba. A griot is really the keeper of knowledge of his community. And he was a singer, a storyteller, a historian, and a genealogist. And Daisy served all those functions for her family. Now, I first heard about Daisy Turner. I was sent a clipping by Margaret MacArthur, the musician and a singer. And she said to me, you should go see Daisy. I always meant to go collect her songs. She's got 1 million songs. She's got all kinds of stories. And I had at that point, I was working for the Vermont Arts Council. I'd done a big folk art exhibit, and my job was to bring the traditional arts to the general public of Vermont. And I thought, in the clipping it said that Daisy Turner was 100. I thought, and at that point, this was 1983, there had been 2 articles that had come out saying that Vermont was the whitest state in the Union. And here was Daisy Turner, and I thought her voice needs to be heard by particularly the school children, but other Vermonters as well. So I was dying to meet her. And so I said about that, and I always looked for an introduction. Well, you can get an introduction to the governor of Vermont without much trouble, but I couldn't get an introduction to Daisy. And then pretty soon I learned she had a gun and was not afraid of using it. So I decided to write her a letter. And then I waited on tenterhooks for about a week and finally called, no answer. And I began to worry that maybe her health was bad and maybe she couldn't see me, or maybe she didn't hear the phone. So I called the next day, and as I said, she was 100. I get this ringing, hello? And I say, Miss Turner? Yes? And so I started in on my spiel about how I wanted to come see her, and Well, she listened for about 5 seconds and turned the tables on me and bellowed, are you a prejudiced woman? And I was totally taken off guard, and I said, no, I don't think so. And she said, well, come anytime. I said, how about next Wednesday? And we were off and running. And I went down to see her, and she was a marvelous storyteller. She held me spellbound, but I didn't know what I was hearing. I was hearing about Virginia and about Africa and about New Orleans and then Maine. And as you know, oral history and memory are considered notoriously unreliable but always meaningful. And my job, I felt, was to determine how this was meaningful. Now, memory and oral history are subjective, they're personal, and often when a memory is laid down and you return to it, you feel the emotion that you once felt. And this sometimes colors memories, but it is also important in understanding voice. Now, at the center of Daisy's storytelling was her father. And I'll just play you a brief clip to show you how she brings you right into the scene.
And then on the top of it all, in the very midst of the terrible situation, Lincoln was shot. Shot dead. Well, then Father said, as he, with his group, was getting ready to be mustered out, they heard, my father told it again and again, he heard the hoofs of Booth's horse as he rode running away from after shooting Lincoln. They was on the edge of Washington, ready to be mustered out. And so Father said, what a time.
Now, her father was a charismatic, powerful man. He was a marvelous storyteller. He was born in 1845, and amazingly, he was willing to look back. Most people who had been enslaved did not look back. They wanted to look forward, but he wanted his family to know where he had come from. And so he was a fine storyteller. He was a good chronicler of events, obviously from his own point of view. But his stories, the Turner narrative, are full of what I call touchstone stories. Stories that cover pivotal events, life-changing moments, full of emotion. For example, when he first realized he was a slave, or later how he killed the overseer and was able to turn his back on slavery. These were touchstone stories. Now, his narrative begins about 1802 to 1810, when his grandmother, or Daisy's great-grandmother, who was an Englishwoman, went out to Africa on her honeymoon in one of her father's trading vessels. And Daisy always said they went to Cape Town. And I didn't understand, Cape Town to me meant South Africa, and I didn't understand how that could be if her great-grandfather was Yoruba. But what I learned was the town behind Cape Coast Castle. Cape Coast Castle was the biggest English fort and the port that the shipping guy always sent his ships to. The town behind it was Cape Town. And then things fell into place. So Daisy's great-grandmother went downwind, and here is Cape Coast Castle, down around Accra, and somewhere around Porto Novo, Badagry, the ship was wrecked, and it experienced probably a tornado. A tornado is a line storm that comes before the rainy season or after the rainy season. And the family story was the ship was wrecked, her husband was drowned, and she was saved by an African chief's son who was a great swimmer. And it was very important that he was a swimmer, was always underscored. And you don't swim on the coast of Benin. The surf was huge. There were all kinds of currents, and then, if that was not enough, there were all kinds of sharks. So the Englishwoman was rescued, but never returned to England. Instead, she had a son by her savior, And he grew up as a Yoruba and became involved first in trade and then eventually slave trading. And as Daisy said, got too smart for his own good. He was captured as a slave himself and brought to this country in a schooner, a Spanish schooner called the Phoenix, out of Havana, Cuba. He was sold in New Orleans to a man called John Golden, and he always said he was sold cheap because he was obstreperous and didn't obey orders and caused a lot of trouble. He was, I later found through research that he was probably sold illegally, and that may well have been why he was sold cheap. But the important thing to the family is to remember that he didn't go along with anything. He was a fighter, and this was very important within the family culture. So he was sold to a man called John Golden in Port Royal, Virginia. This is about 1830. 1830. And John Golden was a sporting man, and Daisy's grandfather refused to work. He was not going to be a slave. A slave was beneath him. And so John Golden put him to fighting gamecocks and to boxing. And the boxing, this is actually Tom Molyneux and the Joe Cribbs. Tom Molyneux was a slave boxer who eventually gained his freedom through boxing. But the boxing matches would have been between the two enslaved men of different plantations. This was the underbelly of slavery. It was not widely known, and it was full of drinking and betting. And they say that there was more money lost or won on these boxing matches than on any of the horse races. So Daisy's grandfather became a local champion, and I suspect that his owner, Jack Golden, bet on all of these matches because he came from a long line of yeoman farmers. But suddenly he is able to buy 720 acres on the Rappahannock River, prime land, land that only the aristocratic plantation owners could afford. And I suspect that this money was gained through betting on these matches. He was also described as a man of strong but uncultivated intellect. And that says to me, okay, he was probably a yeoman farmer with nouveau riche and was moving into the aristocratic plantation owners' land, and they didn't like it much. Anyway, this was his home, and Daisy's grandfather continued to box for him, and he eventually ended up with 2,000 acres on the Rappahannock. Whoops. Daisy's grandfather continued to box until he killed a Jamaican in the ring. And then he refused to fight anymore. He was still his own man. And nothing John Golden could say would make him fight. And he was set to building a wheat barn. A rafter fell on him, and he was killed. This boxing match, I think, also affected John Golden, because he did something really out of character. He was a member of the Liberty Baptist Church, but up until this point had not been active in the Liberty Baptist Church. And he took a group of parishioners out of the Liberty Baptist Church and founded the Bethesda Baptist Church, which was based on no selling of, no drinking of alcoholic beverages. And I think that was his penance. And he went about building the Bethesda Baptist Church. Now, Alec was born in 1845, as I said. This is where his mother's house was, just sort of on, this is the big house, just on the outskirts. And we know this through John Golden's will, and he mentions Rose, who was Alec's mother, and also the plantation seamstress. He mentions where her cabin was in his will. She had a small house and garden, cabin and garden, and the mistress would come down bringing all kinds of clothing to be fitted, or Rose also made all of the slave garments, but she also made, she was working on a dress for Zephy, who was 3 years older than Alec and was about to have a birthday. Now, Alec, at 5, was playing with both white and black children. There was no sort of discrimination between the children until they were a little older. And he suddenly began to realize he was dressed differently. He just had a kind of smock, and they all had shoes and little ruffles on their sleeves and pants. And he asked his mother why he was dressed differently. And she made him a pair of red moccasins. And he was so proud of those red moccasins. And Daisy said he used to strut around in his red moccasins. But he noticed that his mother took them off every time a white person came down. And one day he was strutting around, and Mistress Golden came down and caught him in these red moccasins and threw them in the fire. At which Alec went berserk. He's 5. He bit her. He scratched her. He punched her. She fell in a swoon and was carted off. But all he remembered was the awful look in his mother's eye. She just was frightened to death that he was going to be sold off the plantation. And this obviously did not happen. But this was the real fear. She was able to pull herself together and finish Zephy's dress. And the next day they took it up to the big house, and through this hall here, which was loaded with tables of sweetmeats and cookies and all kinds of good things. And they went in and they went up this enclosed staircase. Rose tried the dress on Zephy. It fit fine. She called Alec to come. He was already charging down the stairs, and he went straight for a plate of ginger soldier cookies and began to bite their heads off. So he was in trouble all over again. And this time he was punished. He was punished by a guy called Pusley. Pusley was the overseer. And the Turners all called him Pusley, but actually his name was Presley. But I like Pusley better. And so Alec was made to carry water to the slaves that were working up and down this long field. It's amazing to me that these fields are still there. He did this for 2 or 3 weeks, and then went on. He took care of the cattle and the horses and the sheep. And then he graduated again to working in the milk house. And Zephy, as I said, was 3 years older than he was and a great friend. And she told him that he must get away. He must get away to Vermont where he would be free, and she would help him. Now, whether she was an abolitionist or not, we don't know. We know she was the granddaughter of Golden. Perhaps there was a generational gap. Who knows? But anyway, she was ready to help him, and she began to teach him how to read. And it was behind the milk house that she would bring down her primer, and he began to learn how to read. One day her grandmother caught them and sent Zeffie to the house, lashed Alec with her whip. He held on to this primer as she tries to take it away, bled on the primer. And this primer he carried, when he eventually escaped the plantation, he carried with him throughout the Civil War. That was how important it was for him, and the signal that he had been learning how to read. Now, Alec did other jobs on the plantation, and one of them was hauling seine. One of the things that he loved was the spirituals that were the work songs that were often sung, and he taught his children all these songs and when they sang them. And so here is an example of one he would sing while seining. Now, this is now 1862, and Confederate soldiers were camped out on the Golden property. And in the Golden House today, you can still see the stuff that they had lent to some of the soldiers: 2 bed quilts, 2 white counterpanes, father's blanket. It sort of brings you right back to when Alec was there. At the same time, across the Rappahannock, the 1st New Jersey Cavalry was camped out, and Ferdinand Dayton was the assistant surgeon, and he came across the river, and Alec told his children later he didn't know what made him so brave, but he talked with Ferdinand Dayton, and Dayton told him when he got together the people that wanted to escape to wave white bed sheets, and he would come across. And that is how Alec escaped. And Captain Broderick heard Alec talking with another slave who had escaped about a Confederate outpost at the Golden plantation, actually John Golden's son, who was right next to John Golden. And they planned a raid to cross the river, and Alec helped lead this to Tom Golden's, to the Chestnut Grove plantation. They captured an outpost of 8 vedettes, and while they're doing that, Alec goes half a mile away to where Pusley's living and shoots him. And that enables him to turn his back on slavery. It was the most important story that he told over and over. But it allowed him to then turn that page and think about the rest of his life. He joined the 1st New Jersey Cavalry, or he worked for Dayton as an orderly. And he went on the campaign up the Shenandoah Valley, and then part of the Virginia campaign, Brandy Station, Gettysburg. And at that point, Dayton helped start up the 2nd New Jersey Cavalry, and Alec again was to go with Dayton. What I learned was that he had been given a furlough, and they were in Arlington waiting for orders. The orders came through, and Dayton and his group left for Tennessee, and poor Alec was left behind. The interesting thing is he never mentions this, or Daisy never mentioned this. She only thought he fought for the 1st New Jersey Cavalry. And just think how he must have felt being left behind. He probably went to City Point. It says he went to City Point. He probably worked in a hospital there. And the interesting thing is he was there for over a year. And after the war, Dayton came back and found him. Took him back to New Jersey, found him a job, and got him enrolled into night school, where Alec spent 2 years. Then he came back to Washington through the Freedmen's Bureau, got a job with A.H. Merrill, who ran a slate quarry of all places in Williamsburg, Maine, which is really the end of the earth. And 38 ex-slaves went up and worked in this slate quarry. This is Alec, right here. And when I saw this, I knew instantly it was Alec. But if you look closely, there is a watch fob there, and here he is again with it on his wedding day. And he used to take men back and forth from Washington to Maine, and many of the men could not survive the winter there. And on one of his trips back, he meets Sally Early, who at that point was a girl of 14. He marries her. They have children. They have twins and then a third daughter, and she is dying of consumption. And so Merrill gets her a doctor down in Boston. She hangs on to life. Alec got a job loading freight at the North Station. And then he's scouring the newspapers for another job and finds one, of all places, in Grafton, Vermont, working for Charles White. He comes up, he checks it out. They tell him Grafton is a very healthy place. And he said a feeling just went right through him. He knew that that was the place for Sally. And they also told him that he would not be able to earn enough money to put salt in his bread. And he was determined to prove them wrong. And so he found out that all Vermonters used a 3.5-pound axe. He had a 4-pound axe made. And he cut twice as much lumber. His conduit into the town was the general store, and he helped unload freight. He was a good storyteller. He was a wonderful singer, and the men began to enjoy him. And finally, one day he was unloading freight, and the storekeeper, Wyman, said, you can have, he said he wanted some flour, 10 pounds of flour, and Wyman said, you can have that barrel if you can carry it home. And Alec said, you're going to lose, because I can do that.
Bill Wyman said, if you could carry a barrel of that flour to Sally and the children on the hill, I'll give it to you. Well, Father said you were lost, because I'll take it up when I go. So Father finally got ready and he got started. So he put the barrel of flour, and he told me many a time just how to do it, just right on the parallel of his shoulder, and started. When he got to the bridge, the first bridge out there, he didn't take it off, but he changed it like that, a little like that, over just a little bit further, because he said he found out, he knew he had to make the hill, and the valve would have to lay a certain way there. So he shifted it then and went home. And my father, glory to his name, Alexander, my father, I'm proud to be your daughter, went on up that road and up that hill and across that long field, because we lived in the shanty, and my father never set that barrel down until he got up in the shanty door. And there must have been at that time 40 men all following him with, with little jugs of Jimmy John and hard cider and all. And Mother told many a time how after they all got up, they all got drunk. of cider down, and they all was saluting him and congratulating on him. And my father carried that barrel of flour from Grafton village up on our hilltop for us children to eat and have bread. Now that's the truth, if I never speak a word again.
She's quite a storyteller, isn't she? Now, Alec he came to Vermont in 1873 and was known as a laborer because he was cutting wood. But by 1878, he was considered a farmer. And what he did was he cleared the land and then bought it cheap and eventually built a house. And he owned, by the time he died, something like 200 acres. He had local help building the house. Everybody gave a day's work. He was also protected by the town fathers. I think really from the underlying racism in Grafton, he became sort of their slaves, their way of helping. And they protected him and eased his way. And he, once people realized who he was, what a wonderful guy he was, they supported him. And he became very successful as a farmer in Grafton. And his family became part of the community. And the kids all went to school. This is Daisy here. This is Susie. She was a twin of Willie. Willie was kind of obstreperous. The Turners used to sell poultry to the Boston market. And so Sally, his mother, would be killing chickens. And he noticed that they'd run around after their heads were lopped off. So he wanted to see if his sister might run around with her head lopped off. So he went after her with a 4-pound axe. And the mother just got there in time. So he was a little bit obstreperous. Whoops. And Alec then, his family began to grow, and he began to have grandchildren, and the Turner Hill property really became a family seat. And I thought I'd go through just to give you some idea of his family. This is one of the oldest twin daughters, Rose. And the interesting thing for me about Rose was that she kept an account book, not really a diary, but she would put down important dates in that account book. Daisy came to Boston in 1921 and spent the night, or some such thing. And most of the daughters, about the time of 1890, when they began to look for jobs, ended up by going down to the Boston area. Her twin sister, Rachel, worked at the Everett Hospital outside Boston and became a practical nurse. And Nellie was the first to get married. Now, they also went to Boston to find husbands because obviously the black community in Vermont was non-existent. And Nellie was the first to marry. That was her son you saw in the photograph with Alec. And this is he at 21. He was an outstanding young athlete, a drummer. He was about to go to law school. He went into a race, had an aneurysm, and died at 21, which was a real tragedy. Lindsay Turner was the first son. He was born in 1875. And an interesting story connected with him. He had two sons out of wedlock. One of these was Leslie Rogers. And about 10 years ago, I got a call from his daughter, Janet Severance, who wanted to go to Ireland. And she needed her birth certificate. And when she got her birth certificate, she discovered M, indicating her father's race. And she was 50, and she knew nothing about this. How would she feel? And she went off to Ireland and sort of got madder and madder and madder. And her father was dead, but her mother was still alive. So when she got back, she questioned her mother. And sure enough, her father was Lindsay's son and had grown up in a white family, the Rogers family. Her daughter, Tamara, went and interviewed her grandmother. Her grandmother was very uncomfortable talking about this, but Tamara was able to get her story, and it was one of racism. The family, the mother's family had disowned her, and the community was not always friendly to them. So Tamara collected all these stories and told them to her siblings and also to her first cousin, who was the son of Janet's brother, and his name is David Rogers. And when she told him, he pulled off his hat and he said, "Now I know why my hair goes crazy when it rains." And then he came back and he said, he began telling his friends, and they all knew. Grafton had not forgotten. It was David Rogers who we were able to do a genome test on. He was the son of a son of a son of a son. And it came back Yoruba, confirming what Daisy had told me, that they came from the Yoruba ethnic group. Now this is Willie, the same one that went after his sister with the axe. And he ended by being a sergeant. This is in World War I. He won the Croix de Guerre, and he was quite an amazing man. And his twin sister, who wanted to be a missionary nurse, found she fainted at the sight of blood. So that escaped her. But her daughter, Ronnie Lanier, became both a missionary and the first black Baptist minister in New England, and was just a marvelous, much beloved woman. And she, in many ways, she encompassed Alec's strong religious underpinnings, but also she was a great athlete and won some amazing trophy for having something like 10 letters in high school. And her brother, Chester, won the Golden Gloves in 1933. So you see again this strain of real prowess and athleticism throughout the Turner family. Now, before, this is Daisy, but before Daisy was born, they had an 8th son who was called Alexander, but within the family was known as Enough. And sadly, he died of pneumonia at 9 months, and after him they had 5 more girls. Daisy being the first after him. And this is Daisy. Daisy never married, but she had a torrid love affair with a white man called Joseph Bonet down in Boston. And they were supposed to be married Christmas Day, and her father took ill, and she went home. He died. By the time she came back, she discovered that this guy had been with another woman. So she brought suit for breach of promise. A black woman against a white man. Now, don't think a white woman had much of a prayer in hell of winning against a white man. And she had the jurors, the 12 white men were jurors. She won a settlement of $3,500 and $3,550. And there's a wonderful photograph of her in the Boston papers saying, "I have been vindicated." So she was tough. Violet was the first to marry a white man, and Alec, because of slavery, did not think that that was a good idea. And indeed, she had a hard time of it. George died early, but in the meantime, he had his dose of racism. This card was sent, and Godfrey, his son, kept this all his life as a stark reminder. And this is Godfrey, who, this was his last walk up Turner Hill. He is 88, and every tree, every stone had a story. And I felt, as I walked up with him, I was suddenly inhabiting the Turner family legacy. Zebby was named after Zeffie, the little girl that taught Alec how to read. And she was the first daughter born in the new house in Vermont. And Evelyn, again, married a white man, a Swede, Dave Carlson. And Violet, also, she married an Italian, Antonio, and this is Sally here with one of her famous hens. And here is, the place really became a family homestead. The daughters came every summer for as long as they could. The only one that didn't come really was Willie, who was working down in New York and then eventually in South America for the Swift Company. But it was totally a family place. And here, Alec lived for 50 years, Sally for 60. She recovered within the first year of being in Vermont. And so two slaves who never could have dreamed of this felt, Alec always said, that he had been led to Grafton, Vermont. And Daisy, who kept this story and was such a marvelous storyteller, knew that the only way that the story would survive was to have it in print, that basically ours is a literate society. And so she began asking me to write it, and I wasn't at all sure I was the right person to do it. I wasn't particularly a good writer, and I thought maybe an African American should do it, but eventually I came around, but I said, which she didn't believe, I think we've got to put, a larger framework behind it. And I did promise her that I would do this, but at that point I was working, I didn't have time. But I felt that the only way her story really would be taken seriously was to document as much of it as could be documented. And what I found was that the stories ended up by being almost flagposts to historical events. And so her story, this really vibrant family story with a distinct voice about a critical time in our American history, has been preserved thanks to Daisy's ability as a storyteller. And here is one last photograph of Daisy on her 104th birthday. I thought she was going to live forever. She recited on that birthday a poem that went on for 20 minutes. She was just plain amazing. Thank you. Any questions?
Right here.
Yes.
After the comments, I think that with the advent of ancestry.com, that people are finding out that more and more people who thought that they were white, in fact, are not. As a matter of fact, I think I read something that said the majority of white Americans have African American blood in them. And the second thing is that there is another family that can trace its ancestry back to Africa, and those are the Quanders, who are local to this area.
Oh, neat.
I worked on the Quander family history with Bernice Regan in the 80s, and then the family took it over, and so you'll see in Alexandria their Quander roads, and they all trace their genealogy back to Amaquando, who got off the boat in Jamestown, and they have an unbroken history of
Wow.
the family from Africa.
Oh, that's
which is amazing.
great. Yes.
And Roe Quander continues to be the family genealogist.
Neat. Thank you. I might add that the Turner family that is left in Grafton is totally white. The ones that went to Boston are African American. Which
I just wanted to make an aside too. An interesting thing happened to me at the book festival this year. I was in the history pavilion, and somebody walked up to me and said, "Oh, I have Fergusons in my family," and it was a white woman. And I said, "Oh, where are your Fergusons from?" She said, "South Carolina." And I said, "So are my Fergusons." And it went on. She said, "What part of South Carolina?" I said, "Orangeburg." And she said, "So are my Fergusons." And then she said, "My Fergusons were Scottish Presbyterian Scottish Methodist ministers." And I said, "My Fergusons were all AME ministers." So we concluded at that point that we had in fact found the white and the black Fergusons who were alive.
That's neat.
How old was she when she died?
She was 104. She died maybe within 6 months of this last photograph. 1988. Yeah?
Oh, go ahead.
Did she tell you what made her live to 104? Yeah.
Did she tell me what?
The secrets of living to that age?
I think mostly for Daisy she was feisty. Yes.
I saw the picture of the slave castle, but I didn't know, you said it was in Cape, it was called the Cape Coast Castle?
Yes.
And that was where?
That was actually in Ghana on the Gold Coast. And the town behind it was called Cape Town, which I didn't realize until I was doing research about it. Yes?
Well, do you think that this book will help lessen racism? Like the lady was saying, a lot of white people have black ancestry and a lot of black people have white ancestry. Do you think all that realization will go beyond what people look like and racism? And is your book helping?
I hope so. You can, at this point, I'm 75, I can only hope.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, you described some additional studies beyond oral history to create this story. You used genetics, you used documentary research. What other disciplines did you dive into? For example, did you try any archaeology with some of those sites you attached the stories to?
I did with the plantation. I found the plantation, and the guy that owned it was had done some archaeological stuff, and I knew where the graveyard was. I was dying to get him to dig, where Rose's cabin was. I was given the line of that from the will of John Golden. But, I didn't do a lot of archaeological stuff. I wished I could have done. I mean, it was private property. I would have done, loved to have done more on the Golden Plantation. Yes.
Did any of the next generation continue the stories?
Yes. The grandchildren all knew. In fact, in the book, at one point I was just going to use Daisy's voice. And then I decided I should use a family voice. And the family voice incorporates many of the grandchildren. For example, some of the oldest grandsons were attracted to Alec as a young boy on the plantation, and they retained much more than Daisy did, who didn't really care about being a young boy on a plantation. And so they had more stories about that than Daisy did. And they all said that his most important story was shooting the overseer. And this was something he told over and over and over again. This raid is well documented, but nothing about shooting the overseer. And yet I'm absolutely convinced it happened. He would, from the rest of his narrative, this is not something he would make up.
What year was that, the raid?
The raid was 1862, April.
Were you able to find census records about the overseer? I mean, his date of death or?
There was a number of questions about the overseer. So no, I was not. And there aren't those kinds of records. But his name was Presley, and the records of overseers, it's every 10 years. Mm-hmm. So I don't, and there was some discussion as to whether he was black or white. And there was a slave called Presley that worked for Jack Golden's father. Was this the Presley? I don't know. That's certainly a question.
One more question.
Yes? Yes.
Can you discuss any of the research or discoveries you had when the transmission of histories from the first early generations to the next?
Got mixed up? Yes, I'll give you one good example. And that is the story Daisy told about her grandmother, who was a Cherokee, full-blooded Cherokee, and her grandfather. They supposedly, her grandfather went with Golden to a place where North, South Carolina, and Georgia all come together, which is a Cherokee reservation. And Rose supposedly went and saw him box. They fell in love, and Golden allowed Daisy's grandfather to get married in the Cherokee tradition, whatever that was, and then carried them back by cart to the Golden Plantation. And so I thought, I went down to Cherokee. I was trying to figure out how Daisy's grandfather, who he would have fought down there. There were not plantations there. And then I came across a court case, and it told me that Rose, and it only refers to her as black, and yet the family, Alec, always said she was a full-blooded Cherokee, so I believe that. But that Rose had been owned by this guy called Miku, who was moving to Mississippi, and she had a bad hip, and he sold her to Jack Golden, who came and said, I have her husband. And Rose at that point had her first child, George, who was Alec's older brother by 10 years. So there was documentation of this sale in 1835. So what had happened was two stories, I think, had been collapsed. I think Rose came from where North and South Carolina and Georgia all come together. But how she was enslaved, I don't know. And that is a good example of mixing up over generations. Okay?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.